Hey folks, so moving on to round 4 in the Minnesota GM Norm tournament, I was paired against the second of 3 GMs in the event, Grandmaster Nikola Mitkov, who I've never played before, but I've seen him around. He's played in a bunch of open tournaments and so on. So I was playing black in this game. He played e4, and I decided to play e5. Lately I've been able to play either this move or the Sicilian, and I've also been playing knight c6 in some games as well. But for this game I decided just to keep it super solid, and the interesting thing about Mitkov is that his opening repertoire is very consistent. He typically sticks to basically one line against every major opening as an e4 player. And I think he varies a little bit, but he's very, very consistent. So he's kind of predictable, but he also knows his stuff really, really well. So definitely can be a difficult player to face. So he goes for bishop c4, knight f6, knight c3, and this is what he typically plays with white against e4, e5. So I was able to prepare this line quite deeply. I played knight c6 and d3. And now the point of this move order, it's kind of like a bishop's opening slash Vienna game with an early knight c3, is that white keeps their options open as far as pushing the f-pawn. So if black plays like bishop c5 here, then f4 is totally viable, basically transposing to the king's gambit. And, well, yeah, okay, there are different ways for black to play this position. A really common one is the move knight to a5, which I think is very logical in fighting against white's development scheme. Here, black is going to be collecting the two bishops, but white is actually quite comfortable in this position. For example, after knight ge2, with knight takes c4, dc4, white really improves their structure quite a bit because the d file opens up and white gets really nice control over the d5 square. If black plays d6 and c6 in this position, then the d6 pawn will be a long-term weakness. And white's setup here I think is extremely fluid and easy to play. Objectively, black should be doing fine, but in my opinion, I think white does get a very, very easy game and very straightforward plans to follow. So I wanted to go for something else. I chose the other main move in the position, bishop b4, which, in my opinion, leads to a somewhat easier game for black to play. Now black's idea is to play d5. White played knight ge2. This is the main line, supporting the knight on c3 and also keeping the f-pawn unblocked. I played d5. This is all pretty typical. Takes, knight takes d5. Now, of course, if white plays bishop takes d5, black can just recapture with the queen thanks to the pin. And here black is doing quite comfortably, having collected the two bishops. Soon the queen will move out of the way and black should be totally fine. So instead, white castles, bishop e6. And now white played bishop takes d5, which looks a little bit counterintuitive, but this is actually the main move in the position. At this point, white really has to figure out what they're doing. It's not so obvious how to develop the dark squared bishops since g5 and e3 aren't really available. d2 isn't so active. And the move f4 is interesting but is not so good here because after knight takes c3, black is going to have a pretty annoying check on this diagonal. So for instance, either b takes c3, bishop c5 check, king h1, and then black can take on c4, and now white is getting these super ugly triple pawns, and black is just going to be much better here. Or if white plays knight takes c3, then after queen d4 check, let's say king h1 and bishop takes c4, black can simply win a pawn, dc4, queen c4, and I don't think white is going to have any good compensation here. Black is much better. So f4 is not really playable. If white wants to trade everything on d5, then black really just doesn't have any problems in the opening whatsoever. I mean, the pieces are developed, the bishop can pull back, king will castle, and black just has a perfectly healthy position. So bishop takes d5 is interestingly kind of the only way for white to really put any pressure on black in this line. And we're still following the main line here. So bishop takes d5, and now the point is to go f4. And so, based on this move, white tries to get some initiative in this position. I think taking on f4 is quite dangerous, because after knight takes f4, I mean, white just clearly gets a lot of activity, and the bishop on d5 doesn't have any good squares. So black has to be, I think, pretty careful here. The main move is castles, which I played, and white decided to push f5. And now f6 is perfectly playable here, but when I was preparing, I figured out that bishop takes c3 is probably the best way to equalize here from black's point of view. The reason is after f6, black is still not going to be able to keep the two bishops anyway. White can play knight takes d5. And then after queen takes d5, I think this position is pretty close to equal, but again, I'm not keeping the two bishops, and I would actually rather keep the light squared bishop versus the dark squared bishop. So based on that, I preferred the move bishop takes c3 here. Now if white takes with the knight, then after f6, I'm not worried about knight takes d5, queen takes d5, because I think in this structure here, black's knight is going to be super strong on d4, and I can play knight d4 and c5, and black should be totally fine. So the only danger, in my opinion, for black in this position is if white can establish their knight on e4, maybe put the queen on e2 or f3, and actually start pushing like g4, g5 on the king side. That's typically what white is kind of playing for in this type of position, especially with this f5 kind of stronghold, is white is trying to keep the center and the queen side kind of under control and closed up, and just push the g-pawn on the king side and try to build this like very slow burning attack. But if too many pieces get traded in the opening, then it's very hard for white to really achieve anything. So yeah, based on the structure, like I mentioned, I would rather keep the light squared bishop because I think this is just a better piece on this board. So I play bishop takes c3. Now, like I mentioned, knight takes c3. It doesn't really have a whole lot of point to it because after f6, white doesn't want to take on d5, and if white goes knight e4, then black will happily take this knight. And I think white is actually not going to be so happy about this position, where in the long run I think the knight will be very happy on d4, or if white plays c3, then it's kind of creating new weaknesses, and black can play like knight a5, knight c4 for example, or just fight for the d file. So I think this position would be totally reasonable for black in the long run. Okay, so after some thought, white decided to play b takes c3. Which I think is quite logical. Despite kind of weakening the pawns, white does take the d4 square under control, which is nice. I pushed f6. I'm still kind of following my prep. Knight g3, definitely the most natural move in the position. Now white's plan is usually to play like queen g4 here, and then maybe knight e4 or bishop e3, and then even look for a rook lift with like rook f3. But the main advantage for black in this position is that if I can just keep the bishop on d5 here, then whenever the knight gets to e4, black is usually happy just to trade it off and leave themselves with a knight versus bishop kind of situation. Okay, so here I actually got to play a new move in this position. I don't think it's ever been played before. It's a fresh novelty, and that was the move knight to a5. And yeah, I mean, of course, this move was pointed out to me by Stockfish. It certainly wasn't my original idea. And when I first saw the move, I felt like it was quite a weird move because the knight is just not doing anything at all in a5. It has no prospects, and it's not even clear what the point is. Like, you know, if black is given an extra move, what exactly is the idea? Okay, after analyzing a bit, I realized the point is that black wants to play b6 and bring the knight via b7 to d6, or sometimes to c5, where the knight is going to be extremely well placed. And the reason for doing it in this kind of funky move order, rather than playing like b6 first, for example, is that Stockfish wants to be able to meet c4 with the move bishop c6. Here, after c4, the bishop would have to come back to f7, and then white kind of gets their dream setup with bringing the knight to e4, and I'm not able to trade this one off. The difference is when black starts with knight a5, after c4, black can just keep the bishop on the diagonal with bishop c6, and here knight e4 is of course going to be met with bishop takes e4, and that's just not going to be good for white. So it's actually a really interesting idea found by the engine, just to keep the bishop on this diagonal, and then black's plan is again just to play b6 and bring the knight back into the game with knight b7, knight d6, where I honestly feel like black is totally fine, has no issues whatsoever. I was analyzing the position for a bit, and I just found it very hard for white to generate an attack. Black is usually just able to create enough counterplay by improving the pieces. Okay, so here my opponent started thinking for quite some time, and he realized that it was not so easy for white to generate an attack here. He played the move c4, I played bishop c6, and actually with his next move bishop d2, he offered a draw, which I was definitely happy to hear, because I felt like, you know, I totally won the opening battle. I was able to equalize and demonstrate a good position, and he had already spent quite a bit of time, and he was basically like trying to bail out and draw the game. Objectively, I still think the position is basically equal, so I didn't really feel like I was going to be able to fight for a win here, and ultimately I decided just to take the draw and call it a day. But had I wanted to play on, I think black's chances would be perfectly reasonable. This move attacks the knight on a5, and now black has a choice either to defend the knight first with b6, or to throw in queen d4 check and then play b6. I think objectively both moves are reasonable. Maybe queen d4 first is slightly more accurate. Here, for example, after white plays rook f2, let's say black plays b6, bishop takes a5, b takes a5. Despite the double pawns, I actually think black is extremely comfortable in this position, because I'm going to be able to use the b file with rook a b8. I can push the pawn down to a3 and fix the b2 square. So one day if a rook lands on b2, this is going to be extremely annoying for white. And I think just this activity definitely more than compensates for the weakness of the double pawns, and black is just doing perfectly comfortable here. It's important that the knight is still kind of dominated by the bishop, can never really come to e4. And if it comes to e2, then it doesn't really have a whole lot of great prospects from here. So white doesn't have to take on a5. I think if he takes on a5, he actually will end up a little bit worse. I think he can make some other move here, and still very close to equal. Black will bring the knight back to c5, maybe to d6. I'll be careful not to get my queen trapped, and white's going to try to slowly develop, maybe rook b1, queen e2, bishop e3, and so on. So objectively, I didn't really think black had any right to play for an advantage here. I decided just to call it a day. A draw is definitely a good result in this game. Black against, high-rated player GM. I didn't really feel like I had some obligation to fight or anything like that. So I took the draw, took a quick rest, and yeah, had some extra time to prepare for my next game. Alright guys, hope you found this video enjoyable, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.